Juzo Itami was a Japanese film director born in the city of Kyoto on May 15, 1933. From an early age, Juzo's profound intelligence and natural talent was obvious to the adults around him, and towards the end of World War II, educational authorities local to Kyoto selected him as a designated prodigy. This meant he was transferred to the Tokubetsu Kagaku Gakyu, part of a government program to foster academic genius. The goal of this class was to produce scientists capable of inventing and engineering superweapons that would be used to defeat the Allied powers. Essentially, the Japanese government wished to create a class of evil geniuses, and Juzo was one of them. But thankfully, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the war to an end, and the special scientific education classes were eventually dissolved in March of 1947. Yet as he grew older, Juzo found himself growing less and less interested in science, and increasingly drawn to the medium of cinema. He started his career as an actor in the 1960s Ginza no Doraneko, but quickly found himself much more comfortable behind the camera, going on to direct the 1984 hit comedy The Funeral. His movies became something of a phenomenon in the late 20th century Japan and were lauded as being funny and insightful while remaining delightfully subtle. They often told stories that were central to the Japanese character, culture, and way of thinking, such as 1985's Tampopo, which tells the tale of a woman who set out to make the perfect noodle. But after establishing himself as Japan's premier comedic film producer, Juzo turned his attention to more serious subject matter. In 1992, Juzo held a mirror up to Japanese society when he made the film Minbo, a satire which poked fun at the traditional Japanese crime families known collectively as the Yakuza. The name Yakuza comes from a traditional Japanese card game known as Oicho Kabu. It is a game where the aim is to draw 3 cards which add to a total score of 9. The rules of the game are fairly complex, but the worst possible 3 cards to draw are 8, 9, and 3, pronounced Yakuza in Japanese. The implication being that if you're in a situation where you're dealing with the Yakuza, you're in the worst situation possible. In the film Minbo, Juzo wrote the Yakuza as being big dumb bullies with a ridiculous dress sense and a perverse set of morals. A set of morals which they believe made them as appearing as chivalrous samurai, but actually made them look archaic and foolish. The film culminates in the Yakuza family in question being completely outwitted by a timid but intelligent female attorney, played by Juzo's wife, Nobuko Miyamoto. The film made a national laughingstock of the much-feared Yakuza, and sparked off something of a judicial revolution in which the police stepped up their prosecutions of Yakuza members, while media outlets began to refer to them only as Boryokudan, a disrespectful term meaning violent gangs. Naturally, Yakuza clans all over Japan were thoroughly outraged by the humiliating depiction of them, and some even sought direct revenge against Juzo. Then, on May 22, 1992, less than a week after the film's initial release in theaters, Juzo was accosted by several members of the Gotogumi, a Shizuoka-based Yakuza clan, who demanded he apologize for the offense that he'd caused. However, instead of groveling, Juzo was defiant in the face of their threats and refused to be intimidated. The Yakuza then attacked, beating him senseless before slashing his face and shoulder with a traditional Japanese sword known as the wakizashi, one that is similar in design but not nearly as big as a katana, used for close-quarters fighting, to behead a defeated opponent, and sometimes to commit seppuku, a form of ritually ending your own life. The brutal attack left Juzo with a large scar on his left cheek, one that would become a symbol of his rebellious defiance, and made the director instantly recognizable when in public, as the attack quickly became national news. As you might expect, the attack didn't silence Juzo, and he went on to become a hugely vocal critic of the Yakuza's flagrant disrespect for Japanese laws and society. The attack on him by the Gotogumi only caused the Japanese government and police to intensify their crackdown on the Yakuza, and a series of high-profile raids saw several hundred Yakuza arrested and charged with offenses ranging from murder and extortion to tax evasion. For the next 5 years, Juzo was a thorn in the Yakuza's side, and it reached the point where several rival Yakuza families actually put their differences aside and met to discuss a permanent solution to the problematic celebrity nemesis. Then, on December 20th, 1997, the then 64-year-old director was found dead just outside of his home, after apparently jumping off of an 8-story roof in what was deemed to be a tragic event of him taking his own life. A popular Japanese celebrity gossip magazine had recently published an article alleging that Juzo was having a secretive affair with a much younger actress with whom he had worked with on several occasions. Juzo denied the accusations in his note that he had left and wrote that he would prove his innocence in a grand display of protest by taking his own life. This was viewed by some as highly suspicious, and although Japanese homicide detectives puzzled over the circumstances, it wasn't entirely unlike Juzo to react so passionately to a perceived injustice. However, in an interesting turn of events, Juzo's wife, Nobuko Miyamoto, was subsequently placed under police protection, apparently to keep her safe from the Yakuza. But just why should she require police protection after her husband taking her own life was a mystery that would only be solved after an investigation by an American journalist, Jake Adelstein. Adelstein grew up in Columbia, Missouri, but moved to Japan at the tender age of 19 to study Japanese literature at Sophia University, one of the country's top private colleges. In 1993, Adelstein became the first non-Japanese staff writer at the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper, where he worked for 12 years. After leaving the Yomiuri, Adelstein published a series of articles on how Yakuza boss Tarimasa Goto made a deal with the FBI to inform on Yakuza incursions into the U.S. in exchange for a liver transplant at the University of California, Los Angeles. In 2019, Adelstein published a memoir about his career as a reporter in Japan, Tokyo Vice, in which he accused Goto of threatening to kill him over the story. It was a shocking expose of just how deep the Yakuza's influence still ran in Japanese society, and one part of the memoir proved to be a terrifying insight into just how much they hated director Juzo Itami. An anonymous source told Adelstein that Tarimasa Goto, the same Yakuza boss who had ordered the scarring attack on Juzo in 1992, had visited him on the day of him apparently taking his life and ordered him to the roof of the building at gunpoint. He then gave Juzo a choice: jump from the 8-story building and give himself a slim chance of survival, or receive a bullet to the brain, which he most definitely would not recover from. According to the source, Juzo chose the former and leapt from the roof, unfortunately dying as a result of his injuries. In the aftermath, the Goto Gumi clan faked the note from Juzo, then leaked a false rumor to Japanese tabloids detailing the alleged affair that was referenced in the bogus note. It was the perfect murder, as there appeared to be no foul play whatsoever and no proof that Juzo had been forced from the rooftop as opposed to jumping voluntarily. As a result, no one has ever been charged with his murder, and the Goto Gumi clan has apparently gotten away with the murder of one of their greatest nemesis. Not by being brutal enough to actually murder him, but by being devious enough to make him end his own life. Around the world, different criminal organizations are known to use different varieties of weapons to terrorize their enemies and secure their illicit business dealings. In the 1990s, the gangbangers of America's West Coast managed to make the Tech-9 a household name. Street gangs in the English capital of London have been known to favor kitchen knives to brutally carve up those they have beef with, while mobsters in 1920s Chicago put the words Tommy gun on everyone's lips. But the Japanese Yakuza clans favor an even deadlier and more terrifying form of weaponry, which they refer to as pineapples. You see, the Yakuza use knives, they use guns, but their true weapon of choice is the hand grenade. The southern Japanese region of Fukuoka, also known as Kyushu, is home to 5 major Yakuza groups with a rough total of 3,000 members. The police in Fukuoka have become the first in Japan, possibly even the world, to offer cash rewards to those who turn in any hand grenades they find, in what is essentially a grenade amnesty. For a good many years now, a war between rival Yakuza clans in Fukuoka have caused ripples of terror among the civilian population due to the liberal use of hand grenades by warring clan members. Since the crackdown on the Yakuza in the mid-90s, many clans have had their revenue streams slashed to a fraction of what they once were, and thousands of clan members have been arrested, tried, and imprisoned. This means that the competition between clans has become even fiercer, and those who remain fight tooth and nail over what remains of the spoils. This means that the competition between clans has become even fiercer, and those who remain fight tooth and nail over what remains of the spoils. The first in a series of ferocious fights began in the summer of 2007, when the head of the Kurame-based Dojinkai clan, a man by the name of Yoshihisa Onaka, was brutally assassinated by a member of the Saidokai, who were perhaps the Dojinkai's biggest rivals. But during the years that followed, it wasn't just Yakuza killing Yakuza. Traditionally speaking, the various clans kept their violence away from the civilian population, but the crackdown on so-called violent gangs marked the beginning of a new era of Yakuza terror. When their economic livelihoods were threatened to such an extent, the Yakuza turned their fury onto the legitimate businesses that were trying to cut ties with them. In November of 2011, Toshihiro Uchino, the elderly president of the Hakishin Construction Company, was trying to cut ties to local Yakuza clans. In response, clan members showed up outside his home, ambushing him with gunfire and hand grenades, murdering him in a shower of shrapnel and bullets in a show of force designed to send a message to all those who sought to begin a new chapter in their lives, free of Yakuza influence. By far the most violent of the Yakuza clans, and the group considered to be the primary user of hand grenades, is the previously mentioned Saidokai clan. Previously based solely in Kyushu, the Saidokai aggressively expanded into Tokyo during the crackdown, getting up several front companies and joining forces with Tadamasa Goto, the Goto-gumi clan leader who is said to have masterminded the elaborate murder of film director Juzo Itami, before attempting to escape the public gaze by masquerading as a Buddhist monk. Upon learning of the collaboration between the two criminal groups, Tokyo police were terrified that hand grenades would be thrown around the capital, which is one of the most populated in the world, noting publicly that a coalition between Goto and the Saidokai doesn't bode well for the public safety. But hand grenades don't just drastically increase the possibility of civilian casualties. They've also proven lethal for the Yakuza members who choose to use them. In April of 2011, 2 members of the Dojinkai headed out to attack the Saidokai headquarters building. The Dojinkai had been subject to several grenade attacks already and sought revenge using the same variety of high-explosive weaponry, with 2 members of the clan driving over to the Saidokai HQ with a box of hand grenades procured from a Tokyo arms dealer. It's unclear exactly how it occurred, but on the way over, one of the hand grenades in the clan member's possession prematurely exploded, setting off a chain reaction which blew the Yakuza and the car to smithereens, engulfing it in flames before it smashed into an electrical pole at the side of the road. The explosive incident sent shockwaves through Yakuza clans up and down the country, and rumor has it that it prompted Yakuza bosses to implement a series of hand grenade handling courses in order to keep clan members safe when using the weapons. Following 6 grenade attacks during the summer of 2011 alone, the Fukuoka police announced that there would be a $1,200 cash reward to anyone who reports any suspects in possession of a hand grenade. If the report leads to the arrest of the owner or to the seizure of the hand grenades, the informant would receive a bonus payment of $12,000 for each grenade. The police announcement also stated that if the owner of the hand grenade happens to be a gang boss, the reward would be proportionately higher. During the same year, they released a large warning message on their website acknowledging a recent rise in crimes committed with hand grenades. And although we think of Japan as a place with an extremely low murder rate, In a place that is largely without firearms, there are a few gun-related crimes every once in a while, not to mention their disproportionately large incidences of hand grenade attacks. The Fukuoka police website was accused of stating the obvious, warning in large red letters that hand grenades are designed for killing people. It lists that the dangers of being within a certain range of a hand grenade blasts and advises people that if they happen to see a hand grenade, do not step on, touch, or throw it. Get away from it as quickly as possible, hide behind something and protect yourself. In 2008, the war between rival Yakuza clans became so bad that in Yurume alone, there were 7 murders, along with more than 20 separate shooting and bombing incidents. This might not seem like a lot, but in a country where the annual murder rate is 1 for every 200,000 people, this amounted to an outrageous amount of violence. What followed was a monumental act of collective courage. Almost 2,000 residents of the Yurume banded together and decided to take the Yakuza clans to court in an attempt to close down their offices. The Yakuza are using weapons like the kind you see in the Iraq War. Grenades, bombs, and guns that can shoot people from 500 meters away, the lawyer of the plaintiffs told a judge. But unfortunately, this did nothing to curtail the violence. On April 10, 2011, in the city of Omuta, 2 people lost their lives, and 12 more were injured in the middle of the night when a hand grenade somehow exploded inside a parked car. The shrapnel killed the driver and passenger, with shards tearing through the chassis of the car and slicing their way into passers-by. Then, just a month later, in May 2011, a horrifically close shave saw a 9-year-old child find a hand grenade in a rice field in Izuka. He took it home to the absolute astonishment of his father, who promptly handed the object over to the local police station less than 2 hours after he discovered it. According to the police, there were no Yakuza gang headquarters where the grenade was found, and the child was extremely lucky not to have blown themselves up with it, as the grenade in question was old and in extremely poor condition. In a testament to the iron will of the Yakuza clans that in a country with an extremely low crime rate, that they would be willing to use something as volatile as hand grenades to settle disputes. Even the most violent American criminal gangs would be hesitant to use explosives, given their unpredictable nature and the capacity they have for unnecessary civilian casualties. Yet the Yakuza apparently have no issue with that, and are more than willing to employ one of the world's most terrifying forms of weaponry against one another, all in the pursuit of wealth and power. We've all seen enough gangster movies to know that when a certain person breaks the rules of a criminal organization, there is a price to pay. This might come in the form of being whacked, as the Italian mafia of the East Coast put it, but it may also involve some kind of monetary restitution, paying a little extra to a capo or mob boss as a way of avoiding the other form of punishment mentioned. But in Japan, the Yakuza clans have another method of atoning for certain transgressions, what is known as yubitsumi. Yubitsumi can literally be translated to finger shortening in English, and is the act of amputating one's little finger. It is a Japanese ritual undertaken by those who wish to apologize for offenses to one another, just as much a method of punishment as a way to show sincere guilt and remorse to an offended party. It is an ancient and storied ritual of atonement, but these days it is primarily performed by the Japanese criminal groups known collectively as the Yakuza, one of the world's most infamous mafia groups. The act of yubitsumi is believed to have originated with a group known as the Bakuto. Commonly acknowledged to be the predecessors of the modern Yakuza, Bakuto plied their trade in towns and highways in feudal Japan, playing traditional dice games such as Hanafuda. They were considered social outcasts, living outside the laws and norms of society, but were often hired by local governments to gamble with laborers, winning back workers' earnings in exchange for a percentage. If a person was considered unable to pay off a gambling debt, yubitsumi was sometimes considered an alternative form of repayment, a message to other debtors to pay back the money they owed, lest they suffer a similar fate. But what made the little finger so significant? The answer is quite simple. In Japanese swordsmanship, known as kendo in Japanese, the little finger's grip is the tightest on the hilt. Therefore, someone who had lost their little finger was unable to grip their sword properly, making them much easier to defeat in a stand-up fight, and in turn, making them something of a burden, much more dependent on the protection of others. On top of being intensely painful, the act would mean a lasting humiliation for those that endured it. It was not just a temporary means of punishment, it was something that would affect a person for the rest of their lives. In order to perform yubitsume, a person lays down on a small clean cloth and lays their left hand onto the cloth facing down. Then, using an extremely sharp knife, often a Japanese tanto, the person cuts off the section of his left little finger above the top knuckle on the finger or the tip of the finger. Then they wrap the severed portion in the cloth and submit the contents graciously to the godfather of his particular clan, known as the oyabun in Japanese. If a more grievous offense is committed, then the person moves on to the next joint of the finger to perform the ritual. Multiple transgressions might well mean cutting off portions of the right little finger too, if no more joints of the left finger remain. The practice of yubitsume can also be very common among the Yakuza. Their strict hierarchical code means clan members are often found to have broken certain rules, and the Yakuza can be just as recognizable by the absence of sections of their little fingers as they are for the full-body tattoos they sport under their well-pressed suits. Only unlike the tattoos, which are only inked in places that can be covered up by their clothing, thus essentially concealing their identities from those around them, the absence of their little finger can be extremely noticeable to those around them. And in recent years, since many Yakuza have sought to leave their various clans, or at least disguise their membership of the organization, and so one Japanese doctor has found himself serving a rather dangerous clientele with a very unusual product. 39-year-old Shintaro Hayashi is a prosthetics maker who built a career making silicone body parts for patients with breast cancer, or legs and arms for those injured in serious accidents. But a decade ago, he started to notice a change in the type of person that patronized his Tokyo-based company, Iwagishi. He started to see a steady increase in men who were asking for custom-made prosthetic pinky fingers. Dr. Hayashi says that there are 3 main reasons that Yakuza visit his business. Some clan members are dragged into his office by girlfriends worried about their reputations. Some are former Yakuza who are eager to move up the corporate ladder but worried about the repercussions of their past being exposed. Others are lifelong Yakuza who have no intention of escaping a life of crime, but need to cover up their identity for some kind of sensitive family-based event, such as a wedding or a funeral. The doctor molds silicone prosthetic pinkies made to seamlessly mask the amputation, making for a smoother transition to the outside world. Priced at nearly $3,000 each, the fingers are carefully painted to match the exact skin color of the client. Former Yakuza members, who make up 5% of Hayashi's business, often keep several sets of fingers for different seasons, a light-skinned version for winter or a tanned look for summer. Hayashi has also produced more than 300 prosthetic fingers and savors the positive transformation each one brings to the lives of those that wear them. Some Yakuza who have only been made to cut off a small section of their pinky finger are able to hide their lack of appendage by making a permanent fist when in public. But after being forced to commit yubitsume so many times, there comes a point when certain men can no longer hide their identities. The increasing demand for prosthetic pinkies coincides with an aggressive push to crack down on the Yakuza. Gang member numbers have steadily declined since the anti-organized crime law went into effect in 1992, but there are still more than 70,000 gang members according to the National Police Agency. In recent years, police have clamped down on cash flows, gang activities, and passed measures aimed at pressuring legitimate businesses to cut ties with the mob, which, as we have come to learn, has caused excessive levels of Yakuza violence in some areas of Japan. One ex-member of the Yamaguchi Gumi had to undergo yubitsume a total of 4 times during his 20-year career in the clan. On the first occasion, He was made to slice the joint of his pinky to atone for causing a bar fight in which a civilian was beaten up, one which drew unnecessary police attention to the clan. Another was punishment for when one of his underlings was caught taking drugs. As the drug user's superior, the Yakuza member had to share some of the blame for his actions and was forced to sever his left pinky even further. He was made to slice off the remainder of his finger when he decided to cut ties with his former clan completely. The former Yakuza's current wife convinced him to try and turn his life around after spending years in a Japanese prison, but because he was missing his pinky, his criminal past was there for all prospective employers to see, so it was almost impossible for him to secure a decent job. The first time I applied for a job, I got cut after the interview. I couldn't write the truth in my resume because I had been in the Yakuza for 20 years, he said during an interview. If you don't have fingers, there's no way to get a sales job. If you put on the finger, you can turn your life around. The anonymous former Yakuza managed to hear of Dr. Hayashi after an exhaustive online search for an artisan prosthetics manufacturer, and says his artificial fingers have aided him in his efforts to change his life for the better. He is currently employed by a company that remodels homes and says he's only once been asked questions regarding his prosthetic fingers. He has to visit Dr. Hayashi at least 4 times a year for what he refers to as touch-ups, a procedure that comprises a repainting of certain discolored parts of the prosthetics. He's amassed more than 100 fingers over the years and keeps extras stored away in case of emergencies. I take off the prosthetic fingers as soon as I get home, the ex-Yakuza adds, and I never wear them on my days off. And so when you find yourself traveling around Japan, you may find yourself sitting next to someone on the Tokyo Metro who has a slightly odd look to one of his pinky fingers. And if you do, it would be extremely advisable that you're excessively polite to such a man, because there's no telling just what horrendous acts of violence he's committed in the past. Acts of violence he's not just inflicted on other people, but those he's inflicted on himself. Junko Furuta was born in Misato, Saitama Prefecture on January 18, 1971. She lived at home with her parents and 2 brothers, one elder and one younger, and could often be found watching her favorite drama series, Tonbo, whenever she wasn't studying. During her teenage years, she attended Yoshio Minami High School and had a part-time job during after-school hours at a plastic molding factory. It was this job that helped her gain enough experience to be offered a job at an electronics retailer where she planned on working after she graduated high school. She was also offered the job because of her almost flawless academic performance, as she had extremely high grades and very infrequent absences. She also saved up money from her part-time job so that she could go on a post-graduation celebration trip around the Japanese home islands. But Junko would never get to go on this trip, as she was about to have a hellish encounter with members of the Japanese criminal organization known as the Yakuza. On November 25, 1988, a teenage boy named Hiroshi Miyano, joined by his friend Nobuharu Minato, was wandering around his hometown village of Musato with mischief on his mind. It was then that they spotted Junko riding her bike home after finishing her shift at the plastic molding factory. Together, they hatched a devious scheme. Nobuharu suddenly gave chase and kicked Junko off her bike before being chased away by Hiroshi, who acted the Good Samaritan and offered to walk her home in safety. The whole thing was a ruse designed to win her trust, and it worked like a charm. Junko accepted the offer and followed Hiroshi, who said he knew a shortcut to the neighborhood she lived in. But unbeknownst to her, Hiroshi was leading her to a nearby warehouse, and once he led her inside, he told her he was a member of one of the world's most feared criminal organizations, the Yakuza. Hiroshi then told Junko that if she did not do everything she was told, he would have her killed. He then indecently assaulted her in the warehouse, then again in a nearby hotel, with Junko so terrified that she dared not raise a peep to anyone she saw as they walked between the 2 places. While they were at the hotel, Hiroshi called his friends from the telephone there, bragging to them that he had procured his own personal plaything. The group of friends had a history of kidnapping girls and carnally attacking them, so his friends pleaded with him to share his new prize. Sickeningly, Hiroshi agreed. Just before 3 a.m. the following morning, Hiroshi forced Junko to follow him to a local park, where 3 of his friends were waiting for them. The boys went through Junko's belongings, finding that her home address was written on one of her notebooks. Now they had the ultimate leverage over her, claiming that if she disobeyed or tried to escape, a team of Yakuza hitmen would murder her mother, father, and brothers in the family home. Junko was then taken to an empty house owned by Nobuharu's parents, where each of the boys took turns beating and defiling her. Junko believed every word of the boys' threats and took each beating without complaint, purely out of love for her family, who by this point were becoming extremely concerned about her absence. On November 27th, Junko's parents contacted the police regarding her disappearance. Word went around town that she was missing, word that soon reached the boys who'd kidnapped her. They argued over letting her go or killing her and disposing of her body, until one of the boys came up with an appalling, shrewd plan. With the same threats of having her family killed, they made Junko call her parents by phone, telling them that she had run away, but was safe with friends and that the police should stop investigating her whereabouts. Whenever Nobuharu's parents came over to check on their son, Hiroshi forced Junko to act like his girlfriend, but since Nobuharu's parents were well aware of Hiroshi's status as a Yakuza and were terrified of him, it wasn't a pretense he had to keep up for long. Nobuharu's brother also seemed to be aware that Junko was being held captive and did absolutely nothing about it out of fear of any Yakuza reprisal. Junko was kept as a Yakuza prisoner for over 40 days and nights, and over the course of this period, she was beaten, tortured, and indecently assaulted by more than 100 other Yakuza members that Hiroshi had invited over. They starved her, hung her from the ceiling, and used her as a human punching bag. They dropped barbells onto her stomach, forced her to eat live cockroaches and drink her own urine. She was also forced to dance and sing to songs while being beaten before being forced to commit numerous lewd acts. On some occasions, she was cut open and objects were inserted into the wounds, some of which included a lit light bulb and ignited fireworks. Junko was burned with cigarettes and lighters, and hot wax was dripped onto her eyelids to seal them shut. The boys also tore off her left nipple with pliers and pierced her breasts with sewing needles. Whenever she passed out from the pain, the boys dunked her head in a bucket of cold water that kept her at the ready, keeping her awake so that the torture could continue. By the end of the 40 days, Junko had been beaten so hard and for so long that her face was almost completely unrecognizable, and as a result of the repeated violations, she had become pregnant. 16 days into Junko's ordeal, Hiroshi invited a boy named Koichi Ihara around to the house. Koichi postured as a tough, young, prospective Yakuza, but was actually horrified by what he saw, how Junko was being treated. When it was his turn to violate her, Koichi found that he didn't have it in him to commit such an atrocious act. He was mocked by the other boys, who bullied him into going through with it, questioning his masculinity and telling him that if he didn't assault her, that he would be kept prisoner too, doomed to suffer similar treatment. Traumatized by what he'd seen and racked with guilt over the things he'd done, Koichi confessed his crimes to his brother as soon as he arrived back at his home. The police were soon contacted, and 2 officers were dispatched to the house where Junko was being kept prisoner. When they arrived at the address, Hiroshi and Nobuharu played dumb, acting outraged that such an accusation had been made. They even had the gall to invite the officers inside to take a look around, calling their bluff in a way that seems absolutely outrageous in retrospect. To the police officers, the invitation was all the proof they needed to believe that the 2 boys were telling the truth, and that there were no crimes being committed inside the house. If they had bothered to search, Junko would still be alive today, as it is widely accepted that despite some serious mental trauma, she would have recovered from the wounds inflicted on her and gone on to live something of a relatively normal life. But as the month of December rolled around, Junko actually found the courage to sneak downstairs to the telephone to call the police, but to her horror, Hiroshi discovered her trying to summon help, smacking her away from the phone and slamming the handset down into the receiver. When the police dispatcher called back, Hiroshi apologized, informed them that the call was an accident, and told the police not to worry. Hiroshi was furious that Junko had attempted to contact the police and savagely beat her as punishment for the perceived offense. At one point during this particularly savage assault, Hiroshi doused Junko's leg with lighter fluid and set them on fire. Junko was in so much pain that she actually started having a seizure, but the boys believed she was faking it to gain sympathy and set her legs on fire all over again. It was about this point in her captivity that Junko reportedly asked her captors to kill her so that her suffering might be over with, but they mocked her for this request and refused, thinking of more imaginative ways to torture her, such as forcing her to sleep outside at night when temperatures would dip below zero. Somehow, despite being on the verge of death, Junko didn't die of hypothermia, but by the time the torture got that severe, it was having a catastrophic effect on her body. Weeks of abuse had caused Junko to lose control of her bladder and bowels, but she was only beaten harder when she urinated on the floor. She was also rendered incapable of drinking water or consuming food, and would vomit profusely after each attempt. But again, instead of slowing down or attempting medical aid, Hiroshi and his minions only beat her harder for making a mess. Such sustained beatings and torture also had a horrific effect on her personal appearance, too. Her face became so swollen that she barely resembled a human being anymore, and her body was so crippled and infected from untreated wounds that she started giving off a sickly, rotting scent that caused Hiroshi and his friends to lose any kind of carnal interest in her. On January 4th, 1989, after a humiliating loss during a game of mahjong, Hiroshi hurried to take his frustrations out on Junko. Taking place over the course of 2 hours, this was perhaps the most brutal, sustained, and cruel beating that she had ever been subjected to, and the details are honestly not worth going into. Given how vile the previous assaults on Junko were, you can imagine how despicable this last one was, and as a result, Junko finally succumbed to her wounds and died later that day. When the boys discovered that she was dead, they wrapped her body in bed sheets and stuffed what remained of her into a travel bag. They then shoved her body into a 55-gallon drum and poured wet concrete into it, driving the drum out into a suburb of Tokyo before dumping it in a secluded area. A few weeks later, on January 23rd, Hiroshi was visited by Japanese police officers and arrested. But as it turns out, this was for an assault on a different girl than Junko, one that had occurred back in December of the previous year. The officers then bluffed Hiroshi into thinking that they knew he had committed more serious crimes, and, out of the blue, he suddenly confessed the killing of Junko and told them where they could find her body. Horrified by the impromptu confession, the police drove out to the secluded spot that Hiroshi had described and found the steel drum that contained Junko's body. Her hands were so badly burned that she couldn't be identified by her fingerprints. So many of her teeth had been knocked out that police initially didn't think she could be identified by her dental records, but a partial match turned out to be enough to confirm that the body did in fact belong to the missing Junko Furuta. In light of the fact that they were juveniles at the time of the offense, the identities of all those confirmed were kept a closely guarded secret by the Japanese courts. However, outraged by the severity of the crime, journalists worked to uncover their names and subsequently published them in national newspapers. Their reasoning was that no one who could commit such horrific acts of carnal violence deserved to remain anonymous, and that they should be named and shamed for the horrendous things they'd done. Not only did Hiroshi Miyano deny that he'd actually murdered Junko, only pleading guilty to the crime of committing bodily injury that resulted in death, but when he finally was convicted of murder in July of 1990, he actually appealed the sentence. Appalled by such a juvenile and cowardly display from Hiroshi, Tokyo High Court Judge Ryuichi Yanase not only denied the appeal, but gave Hiroshi an additional 3 years on top of his original 17, publicly scolding him for his apparent lack of remorse. During Hiroshi's trial, the High Court judge commented that exceptionally grave and atrocious violence had been inflicted upon the victim, and that Junko Furuta had been murdered so brutally that her soul must be wandering in torment. Upon hearing the details of the brutal assault and torture that ended her life, a spectator in the gallery actually passed out from shock. Junko's mother also reportedly had a complete mental breakdown when she learned of her daughter's treatment, which required intense psychiatric treatment to overcome. Hiroshi's parents were so ashamed by the whole ordeal that they sold their home and donated the fee of almost $500,000 to Junko's mother and father. Junko's funeral was held on April 2nd, 1989. One of her friends read a memorial piece that stated, "Jun-chan, welcome back. I have never dreamed that we would see you again in this way. You must have been in so much pain. There must have been so much suffering. The traditional coat we all made for the school festival looked really good on you. We will never forget you. I have heard that the headmaster has presented you with a graduation certificate, so we graduate together, all of us. Jun-chan, there is no more pain for you now, no more suffering. Please rest in peace." The electronics retailer that was due to give Junko a job upon graduation presented her parents with the uniform that she would have worn during her employment, along with their sincere condolences. They placed the uniform in her casket, saying it's what she would have wanted, given how proud she was that she'd secured such a prestigious position at such a young age. What happened to Junko is something that will shake all those that hear it to their core. Yet what happened to her is something that the Yakuza subject young women to far more regularly than will ever be publicized. Yet the Yakuza are still romanticized in a similar way how the Italian-American mob had been idealized in the past. We must be cautious not to put criminal organizations on a pedestal, and we must be quick to remember that it might have been our own sisters or daughters that were subjected to such horrendous treatment by men who saw Junko as little more than an object that he toyed with, then disposed of. May she and all other victims of wanton criminal violence obtain the peace in death that was denied to them in life. "48-year-old Mami Kitamura was a member of the Kitamura Gumi, a Yakuza clan that is affiliated with the Dojinkai Syndicate. Back in 2004, Mami borrowed money from a 58-year-old woman named Sayoko Takami, but was slow to pay the money back. Sayoko apparently paid her a visit and was rather disrespectful and insulting regarding her tardy repayment schedule. Mami kept her calm, apologized for the lack of repayments, then assured Sayoko that she would pay the money back on time in the future. Then on September 18, 2004, Mami and her two sons drove over to Sayoko's home, apparently to make a repayment. Sayoko welcomed them into her home and was dismayed to hear that they had no money to pay back. Instead, Mami strangled the life out of Sayoko while her boys went about shooting Sayoko's 18-year-old son to death. They also shot a friend of the son's, 17-year-old Junichi Hara. Once the killing had subsided, they put each of the victims in a car, then dumped the vehicle in the nearby Suwa River in Omata. 2 days later, they tracked down Sayoko's other son, 15-year-old Joji, and strangled him too, with his body being found dumped in some scrubland by a dog walker the following day. Mami was arrested for the murders the very next day, and she immediately confessed to the killing of the Takami family. Not only that, but she also confessed to murdering 3 other people just a few years before. Police discovered that other accomplices in the murders included none other than 64-year-old Jitsuo Kitamura, Mami's husband, and the leader of the Kitamura Gumi, as well as her 2 sons from previous marriages who turned out to be former sumo wrestlers. During the police raid on Jitsuo's home, he attempted to end his own life with a handgun that he kept in his desk drawer, as the shame of being captured by police was too much to bear. But the gun misfired, and the Yakuza godfather was doomed to face judgment for his crimes. However, Jitsuo made a second attempt to end his own life by grabbing an armed police officer's pistol at the police station. Officers initially believed that he would try to shoot them, but were horrified to see him attempt to put the barrel of the gun in his own head. Yet, officers managed to wrestle the gun from his grip before he had the chance to pull the trigger. Jitsuo then tried another method of keeping his honor intact, by claiming in his initial trial at the Kurume branch of the Fukuoka District Court that he had committed all of the murders alone. But the ploy didn't work, and the police still considered Mami to be the primary instigator and perpetrator of the crimes. During their trial, the Kitamura family were not only completely remorseless regarding their guilt, but they were extremely disruptive of the court proceedings. 27-year-old Takashi Kitamura actually bolted from the courtroom at one point during his trial in a foolish and fruitless attempt to avoid justice, but was once again apprehended by police shortly afterward. You chose lust for money over human life in a cruel and inhumane manner that makes correction difficult, the presiding judge ruled as the death sentences were issued to the mother and son. On October 17, 2006, Mami and one of her sons were sentenced to death, with her husband Jitsuo and their other son sentenced to death the following year. Mami appealed her death sentence in a court appearance on Christmas Day of 2007, but the original sentence was upheld. Upon hearing the judgment, Mami's son Takahiro stood up and screamed "Merry Christmas" in English in a bizarre display of defiant protest in the face of his own death sentence, one that had the entire courtroom aghast at his unhinged demonstration. The Omuta murders are yet another example of how the Japanese Yakuza value money over human life, and due to their outsider status, not to mention the perceived discrimination against them by the rest of the Japanese population, they barely consider those who are not Yakuza to be human or worthy of respect. This discrimination stems from the fact that many Yakuza belong to a specific Japanese social caste known as the Burakumin. The Burakumin are a group whose recorded history goes back to the Heian period in the 11th century. They are descendants of outcast communities of the feudal era, mainly those with occupations considered tainted with death or ritual impurity, such as butchers, executioners, undertakers, or leather workers. They traditionally lived in their own secluded hamlets, away from the wider Japanese population. It is said that the Burakumin account for around 70% of all Yamaguchi-gumi clan members, who are the largest Yakuza syndicate in Japan. It is this deep-rooted disdain for the general population that makes the Yakuza so dangerous. The fact that they are raised from birth to believe that it is essentially them against the world, instilling the Yakuza with an us-versus-them mentality that seems to permeate their every action and business venture. As long as this kind of social discrimination exists in the world, there will always be groups like the Yakuza. There will always be groups whose self-imposed victim status means that they are exempt from society's moral norms. So in the end, it might prove the case that alienation is far more dangerous than any physical weapon on Earth. You might well be familiar with the story of D.B. Cooper, the unidentified man who hijacked a Boeing 727 aircraft in the United States airspace between Portland and Seattle on the afternoon of November 24, 1971, absconding with over $200,000 in ransom money in the process. But 3 years before, in December of 1968, an incident in Japan preceded Cooper's death-defying feat and almost topped the amount of money stolen, too. On the morning of December 10, 1968, 4 Kokobunji branch employees of the Nippon Trust Bank transported almost 300 million yen, about $817,520 at 1968 exchange rates, in the trunk of a company car. The metal boxes were stuffed with the monetary bonuses for the employees of Toshiba's Fuchu factory. The company car was stopped in the street next to Tokyo Fuchu Prison by a young uniformed officer who was riding a police motorcycle. This young police officer informed them that their bank branch manager's house had been blown to pieces in a bomb attack, and that the police had received some very serious terrorist threats that sticks of dynamite had been planted in the transport car. Terrified, the 4 bank employees rushed to exit the vehicle while the officer crawled under the company car in a brave attempt to locate and disarm the bomb. Just moments later, the employees noticed a great deal of black smoke, as well as licking flames coming out from under the car. The officer scrambled back out from underneath, screaming at them to get to a safe distance as the bomb was about to detonate. The employees rushed to take cover, expecting the car to erupt in a fiery conflagration at any moment, but no explosion came. Then suddenly they heard the car's engine rev and watched as the supposed officer simply got into the car and drove away. As it turns out, it was not a bomb attack at all. It was one of the most cunning robberies in Japanese history. Those driving the money-laden company car totally believed the thief was a police officer and accepted his story about the bomb unquestioningly because threatening letters had indeed been sent to the bank manager beforehand, and all company employees were aware of the apparent terroristic threats. The smoke and flames that had been seen turned out to be that of a warning flare that he had cleverly ignited while under the car. The thief then abandoned the company car and transferred the box containing the money to a different car entirely. That car was also abandoned and the boxes transferred once again to another previously stolen vehicle, completely masking the thief's trail. There were numerous pieces of evidence left at the crime scene, including the police motorcycle, which turned out to be a civilian model that had simply been painted white. However, this apparent abundance of evidence turned out to be nothing but common everyday items, scattered around on purpose to confuse the police investigation. A massive investigation was launched, one of the largest in Japanese history at that time. Police posted over 250,000 montage pictures throughout Japan, and the list of suspects included over 100,000 names. Almost 200,000 policemen participated in the investigation in what was a gargantuan concerted effort. In the immediate aftermath of the robbery, the 19-year-old son of a police officer was listed as the prime suspect. He had no alibi but died of cyanide poisoning just 5 days after the robbery. So according to official record, his death was deemed him taking his own life and he was considered not guilty. An associate of the 19-year-old suspect was arrested on an unrelated charge on November 15, 1975, just before the statute of limitations. He had a large amount of money and was suspected of the robbery. The police asked him for an explanation for the money, but he did not say anything, and they were able to prove that his money had come from the robbery. Despite just being 18 years old, he was heavily connected to a local Yakuza clan and had the means and the allies available to organize and execute such a daring robbery. It is theorized that the young man managed to blackmail the police officer's son into committing the crime for him, and then prompted him to end his own life when he threatened to release the humiliating information anyway. It is a scheme that bears all the devious hallmarks of a Yakuza operation, forcing another person to commit a crime to avoid implication altogether. And this is exactly why the Yakuza are some of the most feared and infamous criminals on the face of the earth. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, notice me, Yakuza Senpai.